Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining this conference call. We're going to talk about the Global Protected Area Finance Capacity Needs Assessment that I think most of you probably participated in some way or another, either as a respondent or helping with the survey in the beginning to develop it. I just want to start though by going through the attendees on the call here and just have you quickly introduce yourself. And I'll just call your name and then please unmute yourself, give a quick introduction, and then mute yourself again. It's better, I think, if we're muting when we're not talking. So let's start with Byron.
Hi, Byron Swift with Nature International, work mostly in Latin America on water funds and state protected area funds.
Great, thanks. Thanks for joining. Okay, there's caller one, which I believe Ben is Ben. So Ben Guillon, please.
Yeah, Ben Guillon with Conservation Investment Management in Denver, Colorado. We're registered investment advisors specifically focused on conservation finance. And I've done quite some work on the economics of national park, of the tourism in national park when I was at the World Bank.
Great, thanks, Ben. Okay, there's another person on the phone, and is that you, Melissa? I think so.
Yeah, probably. So Melissa Moy, I lead WF Conservation Finance Program, and WF works on protected area financing around the world, and our group specifically focuses on the project finance for permanence approach to protected area financing. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Okay, Chris from Wolf's Company.
Hello, can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, hello, I'm Chris. I work for Wolf's Company. My company is currently part of the global tenure review of conservation trust funds. And I'm here instead of my colleague, Amilcar Guzman, who couldn't attend, and I'm here to take some notes.
Well, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Okay, Jacob Walker.
Hi, my name is Jacob Walker. I'm the program coordinator for conservation finance at the World Wildlife Fund, and I provide support to Melissa Moy and John Tua.
Great, thanks for joining. Jim Barbarak.
Good morning, everyone. Jim Barbarak, co-director, Center for Protected Area Management, Colorado State University. We do training for conservation practitioners from around the world, and we do short courses or include modules on protected area finance within that training that we do in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, with a focus on Latin America, but occasionally elsewhere.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, John Tua. John, there seems to be a problem with your audio. Can anyone else corroborate that there's a problem with John's audio, or is it just on my side?
No, I'm hearing that.
Yeah, I also heard that.
I'm not sure what the problem is, John. If you could switch to a different form of audio, that would be helpful. Not so important, but
it sounds like he just sucked in a helium-filled balloon.
Exactly, yeah.
A big one. So John wrote in the text, he's from WWF Conservation Finance Team. And
okay.
John, you're saying your audio is bad too, so you probably, I would log out and log back in. Hopefully that'll be better.
Yeah, good idea. Or if you have another computer to switch to, you might want to try that as well, a laptop versus a desktop. Katie?
Hi, this is Katie Matthias from Wildlife Conservation Society. I work in Conservation Solutions, which is a team that supports the WCS field programs in things like business planning for protected areas. And I also work closely with the CFA Secretariat and run the Conservation Trust Investment Survey on Conservation Trust Fund Investment Management.
Thank you so much, Katie. Nicholas.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Finance is an NGO. We implement and finance public and private partnerships for marine protected areas for the effective and sustainable financing. We develop also blended finance solutions for protected areas, and we are working in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Western Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Robert.
Oh, sorry for the delay. Bob Lofterson, Eco Catalyst Foundation. We're located outside of Washington, D.C. We've been focused over 10 years on building local capacity to participate, local capacity with NGOs to participate in public-private partnerships rather, and we're particularly interested in the landscape and seascape approach.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, Dave Myers.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Myers, Executive Director of the CFA, and I'm very pleased to be part of the group.
Great, thanks, Dave. Okay, Tyler, over to you.
Sure. I am a former or reformed, I guess, as you could say, strategy consultant for some Fortune 500 companies, now working as a green business consultant, focusing on businesses and conservation groups, and recently been working with Charles, as you'll see, on the Protected Area Finance Capacity Survey.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Yeah, and I think we have a much better analysis here as a result of Tyler's work with me on this. So thanks so much, Tyler. Tyler and I are going to be co-presenting this. So I'm going to introduce myself, and we're going to start the presentation. So I'm Charles Besancon. I'm the chair of the Protected Area Finance Working Group, and I've been doing that for about a year and a half or so. I've been on the executive committee for CFA for about, I think, 5 years or so, as we've gone through this transition that eventually led to David Myers being hired as the executive director. So when we started the Protected Area Finance Working Group, when we relaunched it, I should say, we needed to develop a work plan. And we thought it would be a good idea to start with a needs assessment to help inform that work plan. So let's start this presentation here. So we have a little bit of background about the survey, and then Tyler's going to tell us about the respondents. I'm going to go through the results of the financing questions, and then we'll talk about next steps. What do we do with all this information that we've just collected? And if you have any specific questions, we have some slides prepared that have more specific details from the analysis. So this is the survey. It was developed in Google Forms. We opened it for responses in March of 2019, and we closed it on July 20th, 2019. We used, sorry, just a second here. We used various email lists in different languages to send out the fact that this existed to try to get responses. In the end, we got 130 valid responses, 105 in English, 17 in Spanish, and 8 in French. So we had 3 versions of the survey running at the same time. The purpose of all this was to understand the capacity needs of protected area practitioners regarding protected area finance. And we thought this would be useful not only for CFA, but for everyone to develop capacity building programs on protected area finance. We hadn't seen that this had been done before, except at a very local scale. So we thought it'd be helpful to have a global view on this issue. But for CFA, it's especially important because we needed to develop a work plan. And so this will help to inform that work plan. Okay, Tyler, tell us about the respondents.
Sure. Thanks, Charles. Well, obviously, one of the points of the survey was to get understanding of financing needs, but before we do that, we needed to understand the individuals and groups that responded, of course, and the data we were able to pull from that. We'll go through it, but First, we started with organization types, then we looked at tenure, locations, types of work, etc. So on the slide you're seeing now, this is the organizational breakdown of those who responded. Obviously, there's quite a number of organization types, but almost 3/4 fall in 3 different groups. So you'll see here that NGOs, governments, and government groups and consultants made up the majority of those who responded. The remaining quarter, roughly, is divided into several different groups. And there's kind of one note here about private businesses. They seemed fairly evenly distributed, but we didn't see any in African region. So that's the organization types. Before we go on to the next slide, any questions on that? If not, we'll go on to membership on slide 7. Here you see we're looking at it through this axis of membership, through the lens, if you will. So first you'll see that the majority of respondents, also roughly 3/4, were not members. And then within that, yes, so within that blue, the majority of members were in Africa, Asia, North America. And then you'll see some in Latin America and Europe. And then we'll get into tenure more later, but it appeared that non-members had longer tenure in both conservation and protected area finance. We'll touch more on tenure later. You have some entry-level theories, if you will, but that's the summary for membership. Any questions on membership? If not, we'll go on to the next slide, which is slide 8. And then here, this is all respondents. There's definitely a leaning in towards North America, but after that, you'll see a fairly even distribution in the larger global regions. When we look at country breakdown within those regions, there's some gaps. Our first theory is that there could just be linguistic limitations based on the number of languages the survey was in, but that cannot be proven yet. So here we basically, again, to reiterate, this is the summary of all respondents, and you'll see, again, a heavier weight in North America, but then a fairly even distribution globally after that. And then we'll go on to slide 9. So this is what I was just referring to. You'll see that within North America, Canada is the most common response or resident location for the respondents. You'll see this in other maps too, but that there's some gaps, especially in the Middle East and in East Asia. But like I said, our original assumption is probably a linguistic challenge. Any questions on the countries or regions where respondents live? If not, we'll go on to the next slide, which is slide 10. And then, so here, this is measuring where groups work. One of the intricacies of this is this question itself is that each individual, especially for those who are on the call who took the survey, if they remember, they were asked to reference first, second, and third regions of work in descending priority or order. So in order to encapsulate that, we created a weighting scheme. You can see more if you want in the appendix on slide, I think 34, 35, but the point of this was just to weigh the first region, second region, third region descend in a descended order. And what you get from this is the fairly clear visual here that Africa is by far the most common work location. And then North America, Asia, and Latin America, but with a quite heavy distribution into Africa. And then on the next slide, what we did was we were curious to see within those regions where are the most common countries. And so within Africa, DRC is the most common country to work in for the groups that responded. But you'll also notice that within North America, Canada is still the most common work location. In the next slide, the next analysis, we wanted to see where people lived versus where they worked. So in general, we noticed that there's about a 90-10 correlation to work and residence. So what that means is that roughly 90% of the respondents lived in the same region they worked in. The only change was in Africa, where it seemed there's about 10% less. So in Africa, 80% live there and about 20% live outside. And you'll notice here, similar in the Caribbean where it's lower, the only significant difference being that in Africa we had vastly more respondents, so the data is a little stronger. Any questions on residency versus work location, and anything up until now about where work is located? All right, we'll go on to 13. So here we were looking to gauge activities that groups are working on. And to note here, you'll see the note that these categories or activities were not mutually exclusive. Respondents could choose multiple different kinds of activities, so that these won't add up to 100%. But to note, these were the more common ones, and we haven't done any analysis yet on kind of the interrelationships of them, but you'll see that large landscape conservation was by far the most common activity. And then in the next section, next slide 14, we looked at tenure and length of work experience. You'll see a slightly inverted relationship with protected area finance, but here is tenure for protected area conservation or nature conservation in general. This is a fairly skewed distribution, so the majority of people were more tenured, 15 years plus, and then there's a fairly even breakdown for all the years below that. We don't know why yet, and you'll see again a similar breakdown with protected area finance. Certainly have some ideas that we can go into, but none that we were able to pull or prove directly from the data. And then if you look at the next slide, you'll see some regional variation. Those three regions, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, respondents, or those who worked there, tended to have longer tenure. And those who worked in Europe and North America had shorter tenure, but kind of flatter across the time periods. So each of those 5-year time groups had a similar percentage. And then next we looked at tenure and protected area finance. So as I mentioned, this is kind of the inverse of the distribution for conservation tenure. This is most people are newer. with a slight uptick in experience at the end, but it's still kind of this flipped relationship to conservation tenure itself. So you have 50% of respondents who have worked less than 5 years in protected area finance, with 25 working 15 plus, and then a smaller proportion in the middle. So it's kind of some sort of uncanny valley situation. And then on slide 17, you'll see that regional variation again, with Latin America having the highest percentage of tenure, with North America, and then Africa. So that kind of, again, to highlight the breakdown or the analysis we did on respondents, organizational types, members, CFA membership, locations in residency and work, and then tenure, and all the variations accordingly. Any questions so far on what we were able to pull from the data from all the respondents? If not, I would flip it back to Charles, who can then go over the analysis we pulled about financing.
Okay, thanks so much, Tyler. Please feel free, anyone, to break in whenever you want here. I want to try to keep this informal. We're just presenting preliminary results. So if you have some burning question, feel free to save it to the end, or you can also just interrupt me, is absolutely fine. So I'm going to cover the financing questions, the results from the financing questions. So we started with the question, in the protected area or areas where you work, is there sufficient funding to achieve your goals? I guess not surprising, people overwhelmingly said no, there is not sufficient financing. There was some regional variation, however. Respondents working in Africa and Latin America reported those regions as the most underfunded, and Europe reported as the most funded. So this variation on the right side of your screen is kind of important. We come back to that in a few other slides when we look at some of the results and we break it down by region. Okay, so respondents thought they didn't have enough funding. When we asked them more specifically, what is the percentage of funding you currently have? You can see the chart here, the bar on the left. So that's 41% of respondents said that they had 25% or less of the amount of funding they needed to achieve the goals in the protected areas where they work. And the bar next to that, that's 39% of people, they had 50% to 25%. So if you add those together, that's about 80% of respondents reported that their protected areas were funded only half of what is needed for effective management. And I would say, again, this is not so surprising based upon conversations I've had with managers over the years. They consistently report that they do not have enough funding. And then we asked respondents, we gave them only two choices. We said, what is more important to achieving your conservation goals? Is it increasing funding, or is it reducing pressures on protected areas? And this was almost a 50-50 split, with a slight win on reducing pressures on the protected area, 52%. So they were almost of equal importance. So some regional variation here. In the United States and Canada, 100% of respondents reported that increasing funding was more important than reducing pressures, while in Mexico, it is only 70%. So apparently in USA and Canada, those pressures are not quite as important as just getting some more funding. Respondents working in Africa reported that they had less funding, and they're more concerned with reducing pressures than increasing funding. So pressures there were more important than increasing funding. which is a bit of a surprising result, I think. Respondents working in Europe would also rather reduce pressures, but as we noted a couple of slides before, they also self-report having higher levels of funding already. Okay, moving on. We asked respondents, how important are the following approaches to achieving conservation, effective conservation and financial sustainability in the protected areas where you work? So we gave them a list of things, and they said that managing funds to promote cost efficiency and management effectiveness was the most important. That's the most important approach to achieving their goals and achieving financial sustainability. So cost efficiency and management effectiveness. Second was building a diverse funding portfolio. And then third was factoring finance into protected area planning and management processes. At the bottom of the list, you can see providing incentives and opportunities for managers to generate and retain funds. That came out the lowest. There were some regional variation. So respondents working in Africa were more interested in building a diverse funding portfolio than other regions. Those working in Europe were least interested in building a diverse funding portfolio. Okay, respondents working in Africa and Asia were much more interested in integrating community needs into their protected area financing. And respondents in Asia and Latin America placed more value in providing managerial incentives for generating and retaining funds than those working in Europe and North America. I'll just pause here for a second so you can absorb this. All right, moving on. There's a positive relationship between levels of funding and cost-efficient administration of funds. So the importance of so that's the first one, positive relationship between levels of funding and cost-efficient administration of funds. So I guess that makes sense. The more money you have, the more important it is to efficiently administer those funds, right? The second one, there's a negative relationship with diversification of the portfolio and integrating natural areas value into the economy. So the importance decreases as you have decreased funding levels. So as you have less money, diversifying your portfolio and integrating natural areas value into the economy also decreases. And I guess this makes sense as well. With less money, it's perhaps less important to do these more complicated kinds of work in protected area finance. Next, the question was, how important are the following skills for your organization or protected area to strengthen protected area finance? So, there's not a whole lot of variation between these. People, seems that there were a lot of positivity for each of these, but if you look at it, you can see the top three were establishing public and private partnerships, proposal and grant writing, and annual budget planning. Actually the first six have very little variation, so you could just look down there. They're all important. Maybe more importantly is what's at the very bottom. So developing concessions came out the lowest. Managing entry or activity fee systems was also quite low. Tourism development, surprisingly, was low. So the importance of public-private partnerships and working with the private sector are positively related to funding levels. So the importance of those increased as funding levels increased. And then the second message here is the importance of international donor financing is negatively correlated to funding levels. So the importance of international donor financing decreases as funding levels increase. So not exactly sure what this means, but it's possible that countries are already either receiving international donor financing or they're receiving enough funding already, and so they're not eligible for international donor financing, and that's why it's not important. And then the last two messages here: groups working in tourism were the least interested in international donor financing, and people working on marine conservation were the least interested in developing concessions. And you can tell me what you think that means, those of you working on marine conservation. I guess it means they don't work much with concessions. Okay, moving on. The question: how likely is your organization or protected area to access or make use of the following to advance your skills in protected area finance? So this is about, so best practice guidelines came out on top here. Toolkits of mechanisms to fund protected areas, and then training and capacity building workshops. Those were the most popular of these. At the bottom of the list, webinars and online training programs. So people overwhelmingly wanted best practice guidelines, and they wanted toolkits. So those were quite important. And somewhere in the middle there is training and capacity building. And then the regional variation on that: respondents working in Asia were most likely to access most of the resources. So when we looked at the distribution across regions, Asia had very high favorability for all of those things. They want everything. While respondents working in European protected areas didn't really, they were much lower on everything. They were not so interested in taking advantage of those things if they existed. Now, the importance of online or virtual training increased as the reported funding levels decreased. So as you have less funding, the importance of online training increased. This was a surprising result for me. I thought it would be the opposite. Conversely, the importance of face-to-face training types increases as reported funding levels increased. So as you have more funding, you're more interested in face-to-face training types. All right, moving on. So the next slide here is about next steps. So I'll just pause here for a minute and ask David if you have any comments or thoughts, and then anybody else who has any comments or thoughts on those results.
Thanks, Charles. Well, first off, I just want to say that was a fascinating exercise, and I do want to, I think we should maybe go back over a few of the different points, and discuss what they mean. I think that in terms of, my first observation is that in terms of the kind of makeup of the responders, I think that a lot of that probably has a lot to do with our outreach, and as you mentioned, obviously language. We did not do this in Chinese or other than anything other than French, Spanish, and English, so that clearly limits the representativeness. But I found a lot of the responses very interesting, and I would love to hear what I think maybe we could go through a couple of the sort of key slides again and discuss what that might mean, and then I'd love to see a prioritized plan from this group about what we can do for these, to support these practitioners. Of course,
yeah,
which is the goal.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, and just to respond to that before opening it up more, one idea we have is to have a review panel. So we have all these raw results, and we have some basic statements written for each, but there's a deeper level of analysis that can be done. And so we're seeking help on that. So I think that might be the appropriate place to delve deep into some of those messages and see what they really mean. But does anyone else, and on my next slide on next steps, that's one of the things listed, and I'll actually be asking for some volunteers for a review panel. But does anyone else have any just comments here before we look at next steps?
Charles, do you don't think it's worth maybe going back to some of the key slides? I'd say there's probably, like, if we focus more on the financial section, I think that there's maybe only two or three or four slides that sort of each summarize the section with the data. It might be worth just having discussions around that, because we have such great group of people here on the phone, rather than spending taking too much time and creating a subcommittee. Let's just kind of go through and share what this means to us, just to get some ideas.
Sure. Okay.
For example, like slides like this, right? That kind of summarize.
Yeah.
So there's probably only 4 or so we could go through.
Right. Okay. So let's look at this slide again. So again, remember the goal here is to develop capacity building programs around these issues. It's not, we didn't collect this data just for the sake of doing a survey. We want to create capacity building programs, and we know organizations like WWF and others, and the consulting companies on here want to contribute their work as well to do this. So here's some raw results. Managing funds to promote cost efficiency and management effectiveness. This was very high on the list. Does this make sense to people?
I just had a question on that one, actually.
Sure.
When you say managing funds for promote cost efficiency and management effectiveness, is that for the fund itself, like in the funding organization or the team, or is that the overall protected area efficiency and effectiveness?
Well, I can tell you what we meant by this. The survey simply had these words, so people had to imagine what it meant. But the intention of this was, yes, at the protected area level, you have a budget. You're either given the budget by your administration, or you're raising your own funds in some other way. So the issue is managing those funds so that there's not waste. So it's very efficient. You're delivering goods and services, and achieving the objectives of your management because you're doing it in the most efficient way. There's no waste here. Does that make sense?
This is Jim Barbarek, and I hear that a lot. I work primarily with field staff in capacity building, and a concern that you hear the news about new multi-million-dollar projects, GEF funding, bilateral funding, etc., or even when countries generate a lot of money through entrance fees, let's say like a Costa Rica, and yet the managers complain regularly that there's not enough trickle down, that bureaucracies are top heavy, a lot of the funds get spent at the central office level, and that there are not adequate investments on the ground, or either in personnel or in day-to-day management or in infrastructure, even though they see these headlines about massive new investments in conservation. So I think that's where that might be coming from, particularly from people who are more working in the field.
Yeah. Any other observations out there?
Yeah, if I can notice the difference between the highest and the lowest in the different approaches is not very important, So for me, the reading of this table is that most of the activities have been identified as important, with some others a little more important, but it's a little more. I will not put so much focus on the first or the second one, because the difference with the last one is not so high.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yep. Anyone else?
This is Bob Lofter-Thune from the Eco Catalyst Foundation. We've been working in the Republic of Moldova, former Soviet Union country, for over 10 years, and we've done some work in South Africa and looking at Kenya and other places. And yeah, I would say our experience is talking to local consultants, local environmental NGO participants, is that they feel that, yeah, I would agree with James, that they feel that from their perspective, not enough money trickles down to them in regards to their capacity building. So I would say that's a pretty common perspective.
Yeah, thank you. From my perspective, this is Charles again. Seeing a lot of protected areas or a lot of countries receiving very large overseas development aid packages, large amounts of money, $15 million from KfW for protected area. It's very difficult to administer those funds for a lot of places. So they really struggle with being efficient and delivering the services in the short time frame they're given. So finding ways to do this most efficiently is something I hear quite often out there. Anyone else?
Hi, it's Melissa. I've got a question. Did the survey address at all the more efficient management of protected area financing? I can't remember. In other words, cost reduction or better management of existing funding.
Only through this question, I think. So we didn't get so specific, no. The other thing I would note here, some limitations to the work we did. We didn't ask people to rate lists of questions very often, so that we would get a true look at things that were really disliked or heavily liked. We often gave people the choice to rate everything, and they could rate everything highly. So you get a lot less variation in the results. However, it's much easier to fill out, because I had created a version of this earlier where I had a lot more ranking, and it was much more complicated and took a lot more effort for someone to fill it in. So the feedback we got was to change. So we did it like this instead. So I think we probably ended up getting more respondents as a result, but perhaps we didn't get quite the level of variation we might have wanted in the beginning. Okay, I'm going to move on to, well, here's the some of the regional variation from that question again.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. I'd go stick to those big summary slides, because again, that a lot of the regional variation had to do with our distribution and things like that.
Okay. So how important are the following skills? So you can imagine someone's going to build a capacity building program and have topics like these for workshops for people around the world. So establishing public-private partnerships comes out on top. Proposal and grant writing, annual budget planning, business and finance plan development. These top four, when I envisioned the results of this survey, I kind of expected to see these come out on top based upon my conversations with managers over the years. You often find there's not much skill in writing proposals and doing budget planning and understanding the finance needs in a protected area. So this is not surprising. I'm glad to see that the expectation was right here. People really do seek those kinds of things. Does anyone have any comment on this?
Charles, this is Jim again. I have a question, and that's to what extent have you been consulting at all with the biofin folks to see if they're doing anything similar like questionnaires. They're in a lot of countries now. They're doing MOOCs. And I was just wondering if there's any gains to be had by consulting with them, seeing what they've done to try to get some value added.
Yeah, good question, Jim. We are. In fact, David Myers, who's the executive director of CFA, comes directly from working with BioFin before taking over as executive director of CFA. So we have various conversations going with BioFin. I'm really looking at the publication of this survey as a good entryway to having even deeper discussions with BioFin and others. But David, do you have anything to comment on that?
Well, yeah, just that you know, this is much more focused on protected area finance. BioFin is a more general thing, but we did do kind of informal surveys of different finance mechanisms and to see what people were most interested in learning. Again, this is at the national level with sort of government primarily, and we do have we have that data. I don't think we ever published that at all, but we could maybe merge that with this. Although in this exercise, we didn't really like present the full list of 160 different finance tools, which is what we kind of tried to do with BioFin. So, but that might be interesting. It might be interesting to bring that data in here and see how it matches up and see what's relevant for protected areas.
Yeah. Anyone else have any comments on this? Is there anything surprising here, or does it exactly match what you would have expected?
Bob Lofterson from ECF again. I would say the people that we work with value peer-to-peer, south-to-south dialogues and networking. I guess especially in the former Soviet Union countries, the Moldovans value talking and working with Ukrainians, Georgians, and they find it very helpful for peer-to-peer, south-to-south dialogues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this slide here, if we were to pull out those countries, if they responded, we may find that they were more interested in the face-to-face kind of tools as opposed to best practice guidelines.
Yeah, I think they value both very much. But I just came back from Georgia yesterday and seeing environmental NGOs talk to each other and relate to each other, and I think it's very important, the face to face.
Yeah, I do too. Actually, in my experience, so this was a bit surprising for me because in my experience, I'm finding people enjoy and seem to gain a lot more from capacity building, training, face-to-face interactions, especially if they're done in country or regionally, because they can build a network and help each other over time, which is something you can't do with a best practice guideline. It's very helpful, but it doesn't help to build long-term kind of support networks. While we're on this slide, is there anything on here that's surprising to anyone, or does it just exactly match what you expected?
Charles, was there any way for this one, for example, to gauge overall interest? Because a lot of these are sort of, I mean, there are different approaches, but they're mutually compatible and reinforcing. For example, you could do training and capacity building workshops built around a toolkit or best practice guidelines. Was there any way that we could gauge how interested they were in training in general and capacity development?
Tyler, can I ask you to help out with this too? Tyler really led on looking across the questions, across different regions and across all the other variables, doing that analysis. So
sure.
please.
I would start with which gives you some sense of distribution of importance. It's slightly visually challenging to look at, but I can go further, but I'd suggest that we start with the appendix. So I think if you look at slide 37, I think.
This one? I've changed the number of slides, so you better look on the screen.
We lost your screen though, Charles.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I've hit pause or undone it. Okay.
Okay. Is it back now?
The next slide, the last slide.
Okay. Is it up for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, so this is the importance level within the scoring. And then I can open up the analysis to see what else we pulled from the variations. But again, you'll see some distribution here in terms of how important something was. You know, giving an example, online training is a little more distributed than the others, which doesn't really answer your question, David, but let me look at if we were able to pull some kind of regional variation. So within the types of training, as Charles went over kind of the inverse relationships or positive relationships, but there really was a high correlation, especially with best practice and funding levels. So the more funding, the less interest. And then another one that had high correlation was, again, the training and capacity. So more funding, less interest in capacity building. And again, similarly with funding mechanisms, there's some variation across organizational type as well. But that we didn't include that because organizational type is somewhat subjective, I guess, and it wasn't statistically significant enough. We also have a breakdown of the activity types and what was important amongst those, i.e. tourism, marine protected areas, community, large landscape. So what we can do is send those out. I will say the main takeaways though are with funding levels. So the distribution of importance in activity type and organization type is somewhat marginal. The main observation was that funding level was one of the biggest impacts on the capacity needs.
Excellent.
So
Thanks.
just to back up what Tyler said. So we started with just looking at the global numbers, the distribution, and then when Tyler started helping me, we started correlating all of the questions together, looking at finance levels, looking at primary activities of practitioners, and then seeing if there was strong correlations. So where we found strong correlations, we've shown them in this presentation. I don't think we've done every imaginable analysis possible, but we've done a lot. So I think we're presenting to you where we found real significant differences and significance overall.
Excellent. A lot of data. I'm realizing the time is getting short here, so maybe so go on to next steps.
Yeah, I think we need to do that. Okay, so we're going to go on to next steps. Well, we need to draft a report. It would be very helpful for us to have a review panel. So your work would be to review what we've written. It would be helpful if you were to also write a bit yourself, but you don't have to. That's not a requirement. It's really just to get some reflection back from the community on this as we as we finalize this. We want to finalize the report by the end of February, so the work of the review panel would be needed in the next 2 months. So, starting after the holidays, I don't think it would be a whole lot of work. We want to launch the report in June 2020 at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. And we want to make this as useful as we can for your work. So we're very open to suggestions for how this might be useful for what you're already doing. And then the next step for us at CFA is to take this needs assessment and create a work plan which helps prioritize CFA's work on protected area finance. So let me just start with this review panel idea. Do I have any volunteers?
Not sure how many of us on this call actually, but I'm available. But I just have very limited experience here. But you can take my name down if you want. It's Nigel Yana.
Thank you, Nigel. Can you spell your last name? It's not appearing on the screen.
Sure. Y-A-R-N-A.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Is there anybody else that would like to volunteer? Okay, I will be asking people offline.
Yeah, Charles, of course,
Yes.
I'll definitely be happy to be part of that for sure.
Good. Thank you, David. I thought so. You were going to be one of the people I was going to volunteer. Okay. All right. So that's great. We don't need a huge group. And then the idea here about suggestions for spreading the information to other audiences. We've lost quite a few people that were on this call here about 15 minutes ago. So, but for those of you that are here, what would be the most useful for you? Let me just pick on somebody, Ben. How can we make this most useful for you? Ben, are you still here? I see your name. You're on.
Doesn't look like he has a microphone working.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. How about Bob?
I think what would be helpful for us would be, and I would be willing to volunteer, even though I have limited experience in protected area finance, but at least from the perspective of let's say capacity building of local environmental NGOs, consultants, south to south dialogue. That would be very important to us. And also I'd be happy to, at least from that perspective, contribute in any way that I could.
Okay, yeah. That's great. Yeah, I can imagine there's numerous ways we could take this information. We could create a whole training program and roll that out. We could create PowerPoint presentations that people can use in their own work. So yeah, I think there's various ways, including in your particular need for South-South cooperation and face-to-face interactions.
That would be great.
Yeah. What about Chris from Wolf's Company? Are you prepared to answer this? I know you said you were here to take notes, but.
Yeah, I'm primarily taking notes for my colleagues, and I just started working, so I don't have a lot of experience in this area, so I wouldn't feel qualified to tell you what we could do with this. Sorry.
Okay, no problem at all. Just since we're just down to a few, I'm going to ask everyone to give any thoughts they have on this or any final thoughts. So Byron.
Yeah, we're very on the ground, and I don't. We deal mostly at the state or the state level, not the national level. So I don't know exactly what we're going to be doing. So I was just interested in the general information that you were presenting. I am working on another working group of CFAs, so yeah, that's our situation here.
Okay, thank you. There's a caller number 4. So I don't have a name for that person, but are you able to reply to the question? Who, I think it's whoever's on the telephone is caller number 4. So if you're on the phone, I'd love to hear from you.
Hey, yeah, I think this is Nigel. I thought I had shown up. No, for me, I'm relatively new in the area. I work for a company, really, Shell, but we do have an employee network that promotes sustainability, and we're looking at different ways to see, how we can, help us protected areas and for me, this is my topic, and the report's quite useful actually, especially in terms of demographics and experience and focus areas. So it's quite useful actually. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. I think there's still someone else on the telephone that I don't think we've heard from. I don't think it's Melissa. So but let's move on. So Jacob Walker. Happy to hear any thoughts you have.
Sorry, I just don't have too much expertise. I really appreciate the presentation, but for right now, I'm mostly just trying to kind of get an idea for what you're doing here and learn a little bit. So with that, those are my thoughts.
Great. Okay, thanks. I can't remember if we already asked Bob this same question or if that was a different one. But Bob, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just you did ask in regards to, and I was saying that south to south dialogue, local capacity building, and also public-private partnerships. I mean, I think that's extremely important.
Before everyone jumps off, I forgot to mention earlier. This is Dave. The one World Conservation Congress proposal that we submitted 6, and the only one that was accepted was a campus session on protected area finance. So in June at the Marseille World Conservation Congress, the CFA is leading a training, I think it's either a 2-hour or a 4-hour training program on protected area finance. So it'd be great to get this working group involved in producing that. So before I was going to say that, I realized I was going to also say, let's see if we, for the last bullet point, which is moving from needs assessment to a work plan. I think we should try to do this. I don't think we should try to write a report and then go to a needs, go to a work plan, but we at least do that in parallel. Like maybe try to develop a work plan quickly based on our initial assessment, and then refine that in parallel as we work more on the report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes good sense. I mean, we've done the needs assessment. I wasn't suggesting we needed the report written before we do that.
Right.
We've got enough to go on right here. Yeah. So now it's just a matter of time and availability of time to do all this work.
Right, but the nice thing is, again, we have this target date of June to produce as I say, a 2-hour or a 4-hour training program, and that might be a really good opportunity to pull together some of these, not practice standards or anything, but some toolkits for training, that kind of thing. So it would be great if we could get everyone's help on that.
Yes, great. Okay, well, thank you, David. And I want to also thank Tyler. Tyler, do you have any final words here? We're kind of over time, but I'd love to have any final thoughts.
No, nothing too pithy, but no, it was interesting to get into the data. I'm sure there's plenty more we could do, but yeah, there are a lot of good takeaways here, and I'm glad people were able to attend the call.
Good. Okay, thanks, Tyler. Well, from me, I just want to thank everyone. This was a very useful exercise and a great discussion about various topics. And got a small team here that we can count on to help review the draft report that we're going to write. With that, I just wish you all happy holidays. Hope you have a nice break, and we'll be in touch soon on all the next steps here. So thanks very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, and happy holiday. Happy holidays to everyone.
Charles. Thank you.